My guest today is Jesús Fernández-Villaverde. Jesús is a professor of economics at the University of Pennsylvania. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Minnesota and is a researcher at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Jesús is an econometrician who studies dynamic equilibrium models in their efficient computation. However, he has also worked on issues related to economic history and political economy.
Thanks for being here. It's really a pleasure to be able to talk about all these things with you. Thank you. So, if you want, I would like to start by drawing on the lessons that you have learned over the last months. You have really taught yourself, you've always been very much a statistician. You've taught yourself all the methods of epidemiologists and gotten quite involved in all that discipline. What have you learned about how the methods are different, how epidemiologists and economists work in different ways? What do we have to learn, and what do they have to learn?
So I will say that the main difference between what they do and what we do is equilibrium responses. So if you take the benchmark model in epidemiology, sometimes it's not the SIR, for susceptible, infected, recover model. And that's a model that explains very well the dynamics, for instance, of how a virus will spread in a population of animals that are not responding endogenously to the spread of the disease. It actually works surprisingly well. For instance, if instead of talking about COVID, which is quite a serious virus, you are just thinking about like a common cold, where no one is really going to do much with respect to it. And what we want to do is model the evolution of a common cold in a building, or the evolution of a common cold in a college at the university. But of course, as soon as you need to consider that this virus has real consequences and people is going to adapt to it, then the model breaks down a little bit. And you really need to consider equilibrium responses. To be absolutely honest, I think that some of the more advanced people in epidemiology already knew about it. If you read some of the books, they have thought about ways to do it. But of course, this is the type of behavior that economists have been thinking about for decades. So in that sense, we had a little bit of a jump start. With respect to economists, I think that in comparison, much of the profession did not have a very strong appreciation at the beginning of the crisis that this is a very nonlinear phenomena. And perhaps because I have worked for many, many decades on nonlinear models, it was a little bit easier for me to see it. But I think that some of the economists that have may miss part of what was going on in late February, early March, it's just that they were not very used to this idea that when you have this type of exponential behavior, things can dramatically change in a couple of weeks. So that, I think, it will be my main lesson.
Thinking about these models, some economists have been talking about, for example, talking about narrative economics, etc., have been talking about the possibility of using this type of models to think about contagion, not just for illnesses, but talking about memes and talking about the spread of ideas, the spread of panics, for example. Do you think those models have this usefulness? Do you think we can draw on them for these other types of behaviors?
I think there is something to be learned. Again, as I was mentioning before, I think that something that implies that you don't need to change your behavior much is probably a situation that is a good model. So I imagine, for instance, if we were modeling the spread of accents, this will be a good model to think about it, because the accents, we know that accents change over time, and it's usually one thing that tends to be a little bit unconscious, and you really want to have the same accent that everyone around you, even at the unconscious level. So I think that a model like this will be a good model to think about this type of things. About ideas, yeah, maybe. On the other hand, ideas also have consequences, and people will have a little bit of endogenous reactions to those. So
what many people have done, including you, is try to draw to some extent on these models, but then enriching them by thinking about indeed these behavioral responses, making them less mechanic, if you allow me to use that word, and introducing these equilibrium responses.
Yes.
What is your sense of how that has worked and how effective that is? What do we learn from that second step?
I think it's amazingly important, and we have really learned a lot. If you look at some of the forecasts that people from EPI came in the late February, early March, they were really, some of the scenarios were doomsday scenarios. And yes, of course, there has been policy interventions, what people call non-pharmaceutical interventions, that have had an impact. But we have discovered that even in those places where those non-pharmacological interventions didn't happen or happened very lightly, the spread of the illness has been very different. And that's just consequence that people react. And in that sense, you really can map the behavior of people very, very clearly based on that, on those equilibrium responses. What I think economists also had a little bit to say is in two aspects that unfortunately I think that people in public policy and in health still don't fully appreciate. One of them is, excuse me about that. One of them is what I'm going to call the identification problem. Mm-hmm. What I mean by that is the following. Our models in economics have different parameter values that control how the model behaves. Those parameter values in natural sciences and by relation with in medical and biological sciences tend to have a tight tight natural interpretation. So think about when we are calibrating, because actually people call calibration, when we are calibrating a basic model of the universe, there are things like the gravitational constants, and there are things like the speed of light. And the speed of light is what the speed of light is. And there is no point in saying that the speed of light can be something different. However, when we are thinking about social models, parameters do not have this independent existence in the same way that the speed of light has. And that means that different combination of parameter values can fit the data in similar ways. And yet they have very different implications for policy. That's what I meant by identification problem. And I don't think that outside social sciences, in particular outside economics, this is a problem that people have thought a lot. And they haven't thought a lot just because it's not very relevant for them. You know, in physics, it doesn't make the sense to say that the speed of light is not identified. And the second issue where perhaps economists have some insights is the idea that parameters cannot be structural. What I mean by that is, and for instance, I have seen tons of papers in epidemiology talking about the fatality ratio of the infection, of the epidemic. And one of the things I say in my papers is that that parameter doesn't make any sense. Doesn't make any sense because first of all, it's dependent on the demographics. You know, it kind of makes the only type of statements that make sense is the fatality ratio conditional on being 70 years old or conditional on being 75 years old. So a number that you get from Spain is not going to work for, let's say, Mexico, just because you have such a different demographics, but it also depends crucially on the health system, depends crucially on comorbidity, depends on so many things that trying to estimate something quote unquote called the fatality ratio just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And that's something we need to keep in mind. And I guess that in economics, because we tend to be more aware that these things are what, you know, in the lingo are called reduced parameters, reduced form parameters, we were a little bit early in realizing that chasing these numbers may not make a lot of sense.
That they are going to change a lot with moments, with the demographics, with the spread, everything.
Exactly.
So Jesus, if you allow me now to move towards the substance of the epidemic from the methods, we have all the time been kind of learning as we go along and kind of not very sure where things were going. And I think that the main thing I remember from this epidemic is confusion. People have been confused. And I think at this moment, in Spain in particular, but in every country, there is a lot of confusion about what's happening. A country like the Netherlands, where I am now, nobody wears a mask. They haven't worn a mask for weeks. They don't seem to be doing anything very special, but the spread doesn't seem to increase. other countries like Spain, it looks like the spread is increasing. England, then you go to Texas and it's out of control. What is your sense about what's the likely dynamics of the illness, given that what we know about the people over the next months? Do you expect new peaks, the illness to come back? Do you expect just to be at this low intensity for a long time? What dynamics can we expect? And I know this question is really
no, of course. And there is so much uncertainty that it's very easy in 6 months to come back and you say, look, you know how wrong he was. So I will say that I will put a 70% probability to the scenario we are going to have localized peaks from time to time. The rates of infection are never going to come back to what they were in March, but in some occasions, especially if the local authorities, the local health authorities are not very competent, you can have important local outpeaks. So let me say a couple of things you were saying about Texas, Florida. As bad as things are in Texas and Florida, you also need to understand that we are still talking about an order of magnitude less cases than what we were having in New York City in early March. It's just that in New York City, we were not be able to test anyone. So, you know, when you are saying, oh, we had 20,000 cases in New York City on day X, and now we are having 10,000 in Florida, we are nearly in the same place. No. In New York that day, we were probably having around 200,000. It's just that we were only testing a 5% of them. Okay. So in that sense, as bad as Texas and Florida are, and in Spain right now, Barcelona and other parts of Catalonia are doing, I think it's still a little bit of an order of magnitude different. And again, coming back to my point before about the structural versus reduced form, I think that different societies have different approaches to how they socialize. And I think this is where you are coming. I don't know the Netherlands that well. I will be surprised if 50 people get together in the Netherlands for a lunch together. That doesn't strike me as my perhaps bias, and I'm terribly sorry if that sounds bad for all my Dutch listeners, a stereotype of how Dutch spend their time. However, in Spain, we had this outbreak in Pamplona where 21 people that had been at a lunch together got the virus. The newspaper didn't want to say how many people were at the lunch, but if 21 got the virus, there must have been at least 40 people. You know, if you are in a society where 40 people lunches are normal, the spread of a disease is going to be very different in a society where, you know, no one has had 40 people in a lunch since Liberation Day in May 1945. And well, those things matter. Let me give you another example. A lot of people have praised the government of Asturias for handling the situation better than in other regions in Spain. And that's true. And I think that the regional government in Asturias has been better, but it's also the case that Asturias is a much more diverse population. The way in which the settlement of the population is very different from other regions of Spain. People tend to live, because of historical reasons, in small houses away from each other, and that means that in a normal day you bump into less people. So over there, without nothing else, you are just having a big differences in transmission rates. Also, there seem to be, and again, now, please take everything I'm going to say with a lot of care because I'm not an expert. But from what I'm reading, there seem to be some indication that there are genetic differences in how we respond to COVID. And we know this exists in many other illnesses, so it will not be completely surprised. But if that's in fact the case, we can be in a situation where countries like Spain and Italy are particularly vulnerable precisely because of our genetic makeup.
So clearly the mix of having more socialization, the cities are very dense, and maybe these other factors you mentioned are.
Yeah, I mean, one thing, and we have talked, the two of us, before about it, and that is quite amazing, is Madrid. Just look at Madrid. The core of Madrid is 3 million people, but the metropolitan area is 6 million people. And in surface is orders of magnitude smaller than many other towns in the world with 2 or 3 million people. We just live together. And if you have those very high densities, you are just going to have many more contagions, no matter how how strongly you care about it.
So given this uncertainty about the rebounds and how big they will be and how much it will come back, talking about the economy is really, really even one order of magnitude still even harder. But many economists have thought that the rebound would be the economy would make this kind of nice V shape, that it would come back. And it seemed that it was happening. It seemed that it was coming back pretty fast. And now things seem to be slowing down. What's your sense about what we can expect of the economic performance of the Western countries, particularly US, but also the European countries over the next few months? Do you think that we're going to go back to roughly normal, or is this going to be really hard to
this will depend a little bit on the dynamics of the epidemic. If the epidemic becomes, just a small trickle down of, let's suppose in a country like Spain, a couple hundred cases a day, and there is never really another big spike, my suspicion is that we can be relatively quickly back into around 96% of economic activity pre-crisis. So you are talking about like 3-4% loss of GDP until a vaccine comes and we really eliminate the virus. If the situation is still a little bit worse and we are forced to take more active measures, then we can still lose a little bit more. Now, with respect to that, I think we also want to gauge that there is a little bit of a small difference between long run and the short run in the following sense. There were, I think, a lot of activities that when the lockdown came could not be performed anymore. Think about in-dine restaurants. Well, some restaurants, now that the lockdowns are a little bit less strict, have reacted. And for instance, all the restaurants close to where I live, they have taken, one thing about the US is most restaurants are like these kind of ugly malls that everyone hates, but they have like big parking lots. What they have done is they have installed the restaurant on the parking lot. They have put a tent, and for the first time in the US, having dinner in a terrace is a feasibility. Well,
the terrace in the parking lot. I'm not sure that
it's not. No, sure. I mean, it's for sure. It's not been in the field and done in Madrid, but it's economic activity is back in some sense, and there are other activities that are a little bit harder. But the point is that as the months pass by, more people is going to be able to accommodate to the new situation better and better. Having said that, yesterday I was in a roundtable at the National Bureau of Economic Research Summer Institute, and one of the things I made like a big fuss about is what data means in the current scenario, and in particular the fact that our current national income and product account system is not well designed to account what is happening right now. Okay, and a very simple example I gave is the following. So how does the teaching done by all the teachers in Spain or in other European countries show up in GDP? Shows up exactly the same that it showed up last year, because the way we account for the education sector is in GDP is just by the money that we pay the teachers and the depreciation of physical capital in buildings. The first one is the same. Teachers in Spain got paid the same in April of 2020 that in April 2019. And the depreciation of capital is just an accounting rule, which is absolutely the same. So funnily enough, even if teachers stay at home for 2 months and they don't do a single Zoom or distance learning, GDP shows up in exactly the same way. So in that sense, what I think we need to be very, very careful is when we read data for the next 6 months is to understand that the statisticians never design our statistics for the current situation. This is not a criticism for statisticians. I mean, they did their job to think about a very particular economy, and it's absolutely absurd to pretend that they should have prepared for this situation, especially because this was in the 1930s. But we really need to be extremely careful about what unemployment means, what inflation means. For instance, let's think about inflation. The data on inflation seems to be very subdued. And if you think about inflation as some measure of a slack in the economy, yes, there's a lot of a slack in the economy and inflation should be subdued. But what is the price of having a nice meal in Madrid without worrying about COVID, well, that has gone to infinity. So along some dimensions, inflation is extremely high. And that's the sense in which, even if you give me the CPI number for the Eurozone over the next month, I'm going to say, yeah, I don't know how to read this very well.
So what the statistical difficulties you said in terms of just output, how far would you extend them? So that's probably all the public sector employees could have been at home and they could have been doing nothing. And then it's going to look like they produced.
Yes.
I mean, what I'm trying to figure out is the true number for the GDP drop is much larger. Is it clear that it's a very clear understatement that the bias is making it or not? Or are there biases in your direction as well?
I think so, because it's hard for me to see areas where we have done much more than before. Mm-hmm. The only one I could think is home production. Over the last 3 months, I have cooked more than ever before in my life. So now, every day, some of our viewers may know that a staple of the Spanish cuisine is gazpacho. Mm-hmm. And now every 2 days, I do like a big tank of gazpacho at home, which I will never do in normal circumstances. So there has been more home production. Some people actually, apparently they tell me, I don't know if this is true or not, but a lot of professional firms are super happy because they say, we sent all consultants at home and now they are producing like 24 hours a day. And they don't have, any excuse to stop for a coffee break when they are in the offices. But I think the bias is probably going down. It's not only the public sector, it's also, for instance, all the non-profit institutions. So my own university, University of Pennsylvania, is private, but the way we compute its GDP is exactly the same as the public sector. And this is funny enough. So you know what happens with GDP if Penn decides we are not going to do that in 2020, or University of Chicago? What will happen with GDP if University of Chicago lowers its tuition next year?
The GDP drops.
No, because the GDP of the University of Chicago is the payment to professors at Chicago. What happens is that the difference between two payments at professors and people cleaning up and administrative staff and what the students pay in tuition is the consumption imputed to the University of Chicago. So if the University of Chicago lowers its tuition, what this shows up is an increase in the consumption of the University of Chicago.
And this is because it's non-profit.
Yeah, because it's a non-profit.
That is.
You haven't thought about that, eh?
No, I haven't thought about that. And I mean, there is another set of biases. You talk about wasting time in the water cooler. There's obviously transport, right? You and I waste enormous amount of times in airports, in going back and forth to conferences, etc. And now we're doing it by Zoom. It's very hard to figure out how much is being lost in terms of output. I mean,
okay, that's true. That's true. So let me give you the positive and the negative. In my view, the positive is that this is opening, for instance, seminars to people that is quote unquote out of the circuit. Mm-hmm. So if you are in a relatively small university, the people that come to your seminar series usually is hard to attract, like the top people in the profession. No? Even if because you just don't have the money. So let me give you a very simple example. I gave over the last few weeks, I have given my paper on COVID in a lot of South American universities. Mm-hmm. The average South American university may not have the budget to bring someone from the US, put him or her in a hotel, etc. And I will not have the time. So suddenly it's easier for them to do a conference. On the other hand, this Zoom is not a great substitute for person to person. So maybe if instead being these universities, London School of Economics is getting less that in-person visit. So there are winners and there are losers. And the second thing that is important is the difference between maintaining existing relations and creating new relations. Yeah. So what I think is true is we can spend this for a year because we already know each other, we have some dynamics, we can interact. But for instance, what is going to happen with the new assistant professors, the new graduate students? For them getting into the circuit through Zoom is going to be much harder. Zoom gives a premium to eloquence, that maybe in person-to-person relation interaction doesn't give it so strongly. And you work at Chicago with Rosen, and Rosen brought the famous paper on the economics of superstars, and the example in the paper, of course, is about records, music records. Why are you going to listen to extraordinary opera singer when, thanks to a DVD, you can listen to an immensely extraordinary opera singer? And this may happen with economics. Why are you going to go to the seminar of a very, very good professor in economics when you can go and listen to the seminar of Ivan Bernin?
So you become much even more of a superstar and more of an unequal society. So this is something I want to discuss. But let me go back to universities for a second, Jesus. You're running the graduate program in Penn, and you've been thinking a lot about universities. And universities have been very hard hit because we put a lot of students in the same place. We let them mix and eat together. It's a perfect petri dish almost.
Yeah.
So the kind of services universities provide are really hard to provide in the middle of the pandemic. And what universities have been doing is all this Zoom, all these other ways to produce. What's your sense about, just specifically focusing on universities for a second, what's your sense about how what needs to be done inside?
Yes, so I think that sometimes we are naive at saying university or education when we really mean a portfolio of very different activities. Penn, Harvard, Princeton, we are not in the business of providing education. What do I mean by that before I get an angry letter or email from my dean? We are in the business of providing an experience. That experience has as a very fundamental component the interaction with your peers. So I study in Spain in a place called ICADE. Academically speaking, ICADE is not that a great place, but historically, it was the place where a lot of the top students will go to study. And basically, this means that you are in a room with a lot of very, very smart people for many years. You become very close personal friends. And now, if I pick up my phone and I call some of them, they will always answer. And in some extent, that's more valuable than whether or not the guy who was teaching me microeconomics had an American Economic Review or he didn't have an American Economic Review. And that's why places like Penn insist that you need to live in the university. So places like Penn, even if you're from Philadelphia, you need to live in campus. And that's the whole point. It's really the experience that they are giving you. And they understand this very, very well. In that sense, if you are substituting that for just me telling you the material of the class online, that disappears. And that forces a complete rethinking of the delivery. Now, Oklahoma State is not in that business. Oklahoma State is in the business of giving kids from Oklahoma enough knowledge about accounting and basic finance that they can go to a local bank and work in a local bank. And knowing some people may be useful for your connections, but it's relatively secondary. So in that sense, how this is affecting each of the two sectors of the university system is very different. On the other hand, the risk that Oklahoma State has is that now that we cannot really provide the full experience, we may be tempted into invading their market and say, well, I cannot really justify charging you $74,000 a year because you are not going to be here at Penn and enjoying the university, but I'm justified in charging $20,000 to a lot of other people around the country, and we are going to offer you a superior education. And maybe what I do online is not worth $70,000, but it's definitely going to be worth $20,000. And then I'm going to eat the market of Oklahoma State. And I think that any person who really wants to think about the future of higher education in general needs to really understand that there is a whole range of universities that do very, very different things. With respect to primary and secondary school, I have studied this in less detail. My impression from what some economists specializing in education are concluding is that the experiment has been quite disappointing. That it's really very difficult to transmit knowledge through Zoom. It may work for a few extremely well-motivated students, but by and large, it's a very poor substitute of in-class teaching.
Looking more broadly, Jesus, there's a lot of other things that have changed beyond education. The commuting patterns, potentially residential patterns, people working from home, having Zoom, having access to their colleagues in different ways. What do you think are changes that fit with existing trends that maybe are going to stay? What are the things that this pandemic might actually, you're somebody who, let me do a detour to tell our viewers that you have been extremely prolific in thinking about and writing about history and economic history for all our humanities history has been of your concern. And pandemics have often brought changes that have been permanent. And do you expect this pandemic to actually make substantive, permanent changes, and what would they be?
So just the very fact that we are doing now Zoom. So everyone, this pandemic has been a gigantic world tutorial on Zoom. And I think that we have realized that there are many meetings that can be done perfectly on Zoom, and the loss is close to zero. And in that sense, for instance, I have been in many faculty meetings in the past, and it was one of those things where I was always asking myself, why in the world I went to the university, and as you were saying before, half an hour commute in one direction, half an hour commute on the other direction for this meeting. And now we are doing the same meeting on Zoom, and I don't think it makes any difference. So my suspicion is that particularly in professional jobs, and again, here we need to be careful because, we are professors and we look at the world from the perspective of of being a professional, but there are many jobs like being a truck driver that you cannot do by Zoom. But I think that all these type of jobs, what I think this is going to accelerate is a pattern of more type of a mixed presence. So what I can see is you're a consultant, you are a lawyer, you are maybe in a university, where in the future you may spend 2 days at home, 3 days at home a week, 2 or 3 days in the office. It was actually already starting to happen. I know that in the US, many firms were already allowing people to telecommute usually Friday. And you could already tell when you were driving on Friday mornings that the highways had much less congestion than the other 4 days of the week. So I think that things like Fridays and Monday becoming work at home days, Tuesday to Thursday becoming work at the office days. This is a pattern that I think is going to stay, and no one is going to be afraid of being like the innovator on this, because everyone has been the innovator. And when that happens, that's going to have consequences, as you were saying, for residential decisions. And I myself has been thinking about it. I said, well, if we are in a situation where in the middle run, I'm only expected to be at the university twice a week, I may decide to change where I live. Because, I may not, I thought about, and I'm not going to give details. I don't want to talk about, my professional decisions to the whole planet. But, I was tempted with a possibility, and I thought it was very attractive, but it implied a little bit of a long commute. Well, now if we're in a situation where the university is only going to expect me to go there twice a week, then, a long commute twice a week is not that bad. A long commute 5 times a week is something I'm not going to consider. Mm-hmm. And I think this is going to have long-run consequences.
That the move towards the superstar cities might be reversed, that people would not value as much living in New York, London, Hong Kong, Madrid, etc.
That can be funny and really paradoxical, because I was, someone who, really emphasized a lot that the dynamics of the world was very driven by this thing. On the other hand, it may also be the case that what really made New York and London attractive or Madrid attractive is amenities, and amenities are going to be different to change. So let me give you an hypothesis, and I want to highlight, this is a conjecture, but I think what may happen with some of these cities is what I'm going to call the traditional London model. So something very interesting about the UK, and you know that better than I do because you live over there longer than I have done, is the fact that a lot happens in London, but a lot of people doesn't really live in London. And then they go to London like once a week or something like that. So you have your beautiful house in the Cotswolds, and it's a beautiful house with your rose garden, etc. And you need to go to London once a week. And that's a little bit of a pain because you need to get into the train, and it's a 1 hour and a half train from the Cotswolds to London, but you do whatever you need to do in London and you come back. So that may imply that London is still going to be doing relatively well. On the other hand, where actually people live is slightly different. And that may have a consequence, for instance, for real prices, for real estate prices. If you have less people willing to pay top dollars or top British pounds for living in London.
So just staying in the long run, one thing that is going to happen after the crisis, given the strong policy response, we haven't really discussed that one, but given the strong policy response and the big growth in expenditure and the drop in revenues by most countries, is an enormous increase in debt by basically everywhere, particularly places like the US, like Spain, places that are being hard hit by this are going to see very large increases in debt. How worried are you about these larger debt levels? I know you were saying that inflation is really difficult to pin down at this point, but are you worried that countries might, that we might have such a large debt overhang that countries this might affect growth, might affect inflation? How do you see this over the medium and long run?
So one thing so I will say two ideas. The first one is, for the time being, we are going to be in a horizon of very low real interest rates. And in that sense, a 150% debt over GDP, it will be the same that a 75% debt over GDP of maybe 20 years ago with a higher interest rate. Having said that, I think that the situation is also going to be very heterogeneous across countries. I think there are going to be some political systems where investors are going to be relatively confident that even if you own 150% of GDP, you are going to be able to service that debt. There are going to be societies or countries where the political dynamics is going to make servicing that debt a little bit harder. And I think more that the weight of the debt per se, I think is the political economy within each of these countries that should be a concern. So if I were an investor, will I be terribly worried about the US or the UK servicing 100% debt over GDP, 150%? I don't think I will be very worried. And I think that experience of Japan for the last 20, 25 years is that that's something you can service. Now, in countries that are very polarized, that there is a lot of population aging, that there are deep ideological divisions about where the country needs to go in the long run, do I think that that may put things in a tougher spot? Yes. And the problem over there is, again, that whether or not you decide to default or to restructure your debt, or you are in a situation where you are forced to do that, can be a very highly nonlinear process, tying down a little bit with the beginning of the conversation, and things can change very, very quickly. And we don't know where that threshold is. So maybe you are 120% and it's perfectly fine. You get to 125 and the dynamics start to be very, very bad, and you start losing it. And I think this, as I was mentioning before, will tie down very, very closely with the political economy of each country. But certainly, as we accumulate more and more debt, the probability of an event where things go bad is increasing. Maybe nothing happens for 10 years, but, this is like you are buying a lottery ticket, and sooner or later that lottery ticket may pay. And that concerns me, in particular, as I was mentioning before, in relation with the aging of the population. Now, a silver lining of the current epidemic is that if we move to telecommute, Zoom, etc., it may be relatively easier to convince people to extend lifespans of work. If you don't really need to go out to work, maybe you can, ask people to work a few more years, stuff like that. And the other thing that it will be, I think, very important for me, and I'm more and more convinced that this is a fundamental problem of how we organize our societies. If I may be speculative just for a few seconds, given that this is a more of an informal meeting, one thing that I find disappointing of our societies is either you work 8 hours a day or you work 0. And yes, I know that some societies have made progress, especially in the north of Europe, on intermediate solutions, but that's something we should really, really push very hard. So for instance, let's think about fertility. Well, one of the reasons why fertility is so low these days is because having a kid and trying to keep a full-time job is very difficult. Can we move to a society, and that usually in addition to it has a gender component because women need to take most of the cost of it, and that generates a number of tensions and unhappiness in the society that I fully understand. So let's imagine that we are in a society that, thanks to the fact that we have more flexible forms of work, thanks to like Zoom, I can go from being expected to work 8 hours a day to be expected to work 6 hours and a half. And then it's much easier to reconcile work, with family. And in the old world where you have like a factory, that's very difficult to accomplish. In a world where you are going to have much more telework, that should be much easier to adapt. And I think also governments should have a little bit of a leading role. And let me tell you what I mean by that. A lot of what we do is about coordination. I want to be at 9 o'clock in the office because someone else is going to be at 9 o'clock in the office. And I think that sometimes this coordination is a little bit like in games, you just need to have like a focal point. And I think that governments can help into coordinating us in good focal points. So I can imagine many people who are 65, 66 and are reluctant to work 8 hours a day. But at the same time, they are not very happy with working 0 hours a day. Actually, if I were going to retire tomorrow, my main problem is I wake up in the morning, what the heck do I do? So if we could go to a society where you can work 5 hours a day, 4 hours a day, and this is very flexible, maybe we can extend the life work of many people. They will add to GDP. That will help us a lot to transition. And in addition to it, I think it will have a positive health benefits. We have actually quite a bit of evidence that when people suddenly retire from 8 hours a week to 0, especially if they are males, they tend to drink, they tend to gain weight, and keeping, instead of going like this, kind of doing more of an exponential decay, I think that will help societies a lot. And we have, thanks to telecommuting and Zoom, we may be able to do that much better than in the past.
Jesus, I don't resist asking you a last question on China. You've been very much a follower for many reasons of the trajectory of China. And we all are kind of very concerned with what we've seen in Hong Kong, with the new aggressiveness with India, with the US. And China seems to be really asserting itself in a different way. And Communist Party seems to be much more dominated by one person. It seems to be moving towards a one-person rule. Is China changing? Are we failing at building containing it? Are we going to move to a phase where a Cold War is the only future? What's your sense of what's going on?
In the short run, I think that you're right. The most likely scenario is a new Cold War. I think that the current leadership in China has a very authoritarian understanding of the world. If I may, let me give to the listeners 1 minute historical background. Chinese have always thought of themselves as the centers of the universe. After all, they call themselves the Middle Kingdom. That's actually not a very accurate translation of what they really mean. By Middle Kingdom, they really mean kind of the center of the world, literally. And for them, the fact that they were bullied by Western powers for over a century, what they call the 100 years of humiliation, is such a fundamental fact in their national imagination that for us it is hard to understand. Chinese children are raised in thinking about the rape of Nanjing. Foreigners came and killed millions of people in our land. And I understand that, they like maybe 30 million Chinese died during the extended World War II. If you ask your kid, or go out if you're in the Netherlands and ask any kid, when did World War II started? They're going to say 1939. Chinese will say no. It started before, when we were invaded by the Japanese. The fact that we don't even quote the beginning of World War II in some sense, quote unquote, properly, just says it all from the perspective. And they say, look, from that perspective, we need to be strong. And my understanding always of what Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping were is Stalin or Lenin were communist who happened to be in one case Russian and in the other case Georgian. Mao and Deng Xiaoping were Chinese who happened to be communist. And that's fundamental. Why? Because Mao or Deng thought China is the center of the world. We need to be strong again. How are we strong again? With the best political technology there is. And they thought that the best political technology at the time was communism. And that's why Deng Xiaoping can get rid of the idea of communism in ways that Gorbachev can never get rid of, because Gorbachev is still a communist. Then he later evolved to being a social democrat. And what I think has happened is that the current leadership doesn't think anymore that a Western democracy is the best way to organize society, is a quote-unquote superior technology that will make China strong enough. They think that some type of a state capitalism, where firms are directed by a central government, even if day-to-day operations is mediated by the market, and a very authoritarian government is the way to go. They look at Western societies and they say, you let people make crazy decisions and be democratic, and what you get is chaos and it's bad governance, and they are really convinced that this is the way to go. And that really builds from this very, very strong nationalism that I was mentioning before. Now, they also face a lot of challenges, and those challenges may undermine their ability to control their nation. The first and fundamental challenge is the demographic changes. China is aging extremely fast. The working age population has already been falling for at least 3 or 4 years. The total number of Chinese will probably start falling in another 10, 12 years. And as they age, GDP growth of China is just going to be extremely different. So let me give you this in a very simple way. Imagine that you have a country where GDP productivity growth is 2% a year, and your working age population grows 1% a year. So in a quote-unquote normal year, you grow 3%, 2% productivity growth plus 1% population growth. That gives you 3%. Take the same country with the same productivity growth, but now working age population is falling 1% a year. So a quote-unquote normal year is a 1-year productivity growth. It's a 1-year GDP growth. Why? Just because of population dynamics. So that means that China is not going to be able to grow much more than a 3 or a 2.5% in the middle run a year, just because the population is going to be falling, the working age population is going to be falling, and the easy transition and the easy catch up with respect to the Western frontier of technology has already been accomplished. And that's going to induce a lot of tensions within the country once you cannot deliver more than 2 or 3% GDP growth per year. And then on that, again, I think, and really what is going to happen, I think there are more and more younger generations that may be a little bit skeptic about why we need this type of authoritarian regime. And that may impose a lot of constraints on what the government can do. So there are scenarios where the current regime collapses or they move to a democratization. Certainly, I don't see those as the most likely scenario, although, of course, there's so much uncertainty that who knows. And what I think is going to happen is that the US when they have a next administration, regardless if it's Democratic or Republican, they are going to keep a very aggressive stand against China. They are going to get a tighter connection with India and Japan, and basically try to play a strategy of cycling China in a chain that is going to be around Japan, China, Taiwan, surprisingly enough, Vietnam, and India, and then China is going to become more and more concerned that they are completely surrounded by quote-unquote enemies, and that's going to generate a lot of very negative dynamics. And the wild card in that strategic consideration, of course, is what is going to happen with Russia, which is, a big chunk of their north frontier.
So thank you very much, Jesus. That was really a pleasure.